Hi class, welcome back. Today we are getting into chapter 16, part 2. So just as a reminder, we were talking about chapter 16, part 1, about westward expansion. This lecture is going to get into more of sort of traditionally what we think of when we think of the Gilded Age, the politics and business of the time period, the big robber barons, the Andrew Carnegies, the John Rockefellers, right? Sort of the traditional Gilded Age period. And when we think of Gilded Age, we're generally speaking about the dates between 1870s and 1910. And again, there's flexibility there, but this is basically the era of unregulated business, industry. You're seeing some people getting very, very, very wealthy as a result of unregulated business and industry and a stock market. But on the other hand, you're also seeing these huge inequality gaps where the majority of the population in the United States is very, very poor. So let's look at our key terms today. We're going to be getting into talking about the transcontinental railroad. After we've defined the Gilded Age, we're going to talk about the transcontinental railroad. We're going to talk about the power of the railroads. And then we're going to talk about the stock market, how the stock market works and operates, and the importance of the stock market during this time period. Then we're going to talk about a couple of examples of Gilded Age robber barons, Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller. And then we're also going to talk about some of the business practices that they use to get very rich, vertical and horizontal integration. Then we're going to move to talk about some of the cultural changes taking place during the Gilded Age. We're going to talk about the new inventions and how those are having an impact on people's lives. We're going to talk about the impact of the analog revolution, and I'm going to define what the analog revolution is, and we're going to talk about what type of impact it had on not just American society, but also across the globe. And then finally, we're going to be talking about and defining social Darwinism. So let's get started. So to begin, we're going to talk about the Gilded Age. What does the Gilded Age mean? Well, this term was actually coined by an author at this time period, Mark Twain, also known as Samuel Clemens, who in 1873 wrote a book. And this book was essentially a satire. And this is the cover of the book. It says, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. And as you can see, there's this, diamond ring surrounding it, and it's kind of flecked in gold. So what does gilded mean? Gilded is essentially where you take something and you cover it in gold. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily increase the value of that too much, but it makes it look really pretty and shiny on the outside, right? So you could take something that has little to no value, cover it in gold, and it might look really shiny and pretty and nice on the outside, but on the inside, it might not be worth very much. And so that's kind of what Mark Twain was trying to say when he wrote this book, is that on the outside, right, the Gilded Age might look very fancy, and there might be, people with incredible amounts of wealth, and they're flaunting their wealth. But on the inside, if you take a closer look, this wealth is basically fueled by political corruption, by greed, by materialism, right? So this idea that something that looks pretty on the outside is not necessarily truly worth anything on the inside. So here is a portrait of Mark Twain, again, the person who coined the term Gilded Age in his 1873 satire. So, one of the things to understand about the Gilded Age is this idea of the stock market. So, the stock market is going to become a real thing at the end of the 19th century. It had already existed prior to that, but there was not a lot of publicly traded companies and not a lot of people really engaged in investing in public companies. You had to be, member of a real like small elite minority, right, to start to trade on the stock market. But by the time we get to the latter half of the 19th century, trading on the stock market becomes more common, and the amount of companies that are going to be traded on the stock market increase. So, as many of you probably know, the stock market is a place where publicly traded companies are valued, right? So, um, for example, if you wanted to invest in a company, you could do it if it was a publicly traded company in the stock market. So, the way to invest in a company is to buy shares of that company. And the whole game, sort of behind the stock market, is that you want to buy those shares when they are low in value, and then you wait until they increase in value and you sell them for a profit. Okay, so this is called investment, right? You're taking these investments and you're basically hoping that your stock is going to increase in value. So, one of the things to keep in mind is that during this time period, you can see that um, the investment, right, is based on speculation primarily. So, speculation is basically where you're saying to yourself, I think, I hope, I pray, right, that this particular company is going to increase in value. It might not necessarily be based in any sort of science or hard evidence or whatever, but I believe that this particular product will become more valuable, will become more highly desired, etc. So that's okay, and you can do that, and a lot of people do that invest in the stock market. But the problem is it's not a very sound strategy, right? Because what could happen is those companies could eventually fail. And there were a lot of companies that did fail during this time period. And so that ends up causing a series of boom and bust cycles, boom and bust cycles. And this will lead to um, two major crashes in the late 19th century. Sorry, I'm trying to do my pen here. So there are two dates you want to keep in mind for this. One is, let's see if I can manage to draw this. One is 1873, and the other is 1890. This is funny. 3. So those two dates, these 2 years are 2 years where the U.S. economy will seriously tank. And those are important to know moving forward, because when economies go down, unemployment rates increase. And keep in mind that during this time period, you did not have any kind of social safety net. So, for example, as we're all hearing on the news today, because of the COVID-19 outbreak, many people are going out and filing for unemployment, right? Because of their jobs shut down or whatever. And when that happens, you hope that you will be eventually get an unemployment check. That type of social safety net did not exist during this time period. So what happens when these big, depressions take place in 1873 and 1893 is that we're going to see a bunch of labor unrest. So we're going to see a bunch of labor strikes, and we're also going to see a lot of discontent with the state of politics and with the state of business. But we'll talk more about that moving forward. But the main thing to know about this particular um, point at the stock market is that during this time period, during the Gilded Age, boom and bust cycles become the norm for the American economy. And that will eventually cause a lot of hardship for a lot of Americans. Okay, so now we're going to move ahead and talk about one of my favorite topics in American history, and that's the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So in 1862, during the American Civil War, there was a law passed called the Pacific Railroad Act. And this laid the foundation down for building the transcontinental lines. So these will be the railroad lines that run all the way across the country. And as you can see, there will be 5 of these transcontinental lines built and completed between 1869 and 1893. The very first transcontinental line will be completed in 1869. Now, when this act was passed in 1862, the guidelines for how these transcontinental lines would be built were laid out in that law. And basically what they said is this would be a government subsidized project, but there were also required to obtain their own financing. So basically what you're going to have are going to be companies that will emerge that will get government contracts. Okay, government contracts. There are 2 major companies that get government contracts during this time period. One is the Central Pacific, and the other is the Union Pacific. That will be the first 2 railroad companies to get these government subsidized contracts. So basically, the way that it worked was that the government would provide the land and some of the buildings along the railroad line, like the water towers and things like that. And then the company would supply the workers, right, and the supplies. And so that's the way that the deal works. So it was kind of a cooperation between government and private companies. As I mentioned, the first to get the contracts were the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. And they will build the 2 railroad lines, one going from California. Okay, and the other starting in Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, to be exact. Okay, so you've got one company starting from Nebraska. This is the Union Pacific, and one company starting from Sacramento, California, and this is the Central Pacific. And they will meet at Promontory Point in Utah in 1869. May 10th of 1869 to be exact. So this is a very famous photograph, very staged photograph commemorating this event on May 10th of 1869. And it's very much staged. What you don't see in this photograph are actually the workers who worked on the railroad. These are mostly executives. There may be a few workers thrown into the photograph, for good measure, it looks like these guys probably are workers. But basically, for the Central Pacific, the majority of the workers were Chinese laborers. About 12,000 Chinese laborers helped build this half of the first transcontinental line. On this side, on the Union Pacific side, primarily who you had working as the labor force were Irish immigrants and African Americans. Okay, so this is a map that shows us various things. The first is you can see all of those lines that you see on this map in black are the railroads in operation by 1870. So you'll see that the only transcontinental line is this one here, right? And I just described that one. It had started right here in Sacramento, and then they had to get across the Sierra Nevada, which was an incredible endeavor because you have, granite that they had to blast through and everything, and they managed to do it. It was very dangerous work, and again, thanks to the Chinese workers, it was accomplished. And then they continued to build across Nevada until they get into Utah. And then right about here is where Promontory Point is. And then here you can see that the Union Pacific had to build all the way from Omaha to Promontory Point. So they were building a greater distance, but they didn't have as many obstacles and barriers as the Central Pacific had. You'll also notice that California was very quick to build a bunch of spur lines out here to San Francisco, etc. So that's the first transcontinental line. You'll notice that there are others that will eventually be built. And all of the areas that you see here in red are railroads under construction between 1870 and 1890. And you'll notice here we have actually one of the southern transcontinental line that actually goes right through the Coachella Valley right here, and that was built in the 1880s. And then you'll notice also how dense the railroad lines are out here in the Midwest and also along the eastern seaboard. But of course, as we get out here with more geographic obstacles, less people and greater distances, you don't have quite as much of a dense railroad system. But basically, this is the way that the railroad system would have looked in the United States by 1890. So, railroads were definitely the engines of progress during this time period, right? I mean, not only are they obviously going to be really critical in terms of transportation and communication, and the communication part of this had a lot to do with the telegraph. The telegraph would oftentimes be built alongside the railroad. So there would be a telegraph line that would run right alongside the railroad track. And that was so that the telegraph line could be serviced on a regular basis. It was also so that the telegraph operators could be placed every 50 miles to transmit the telegraph message. And I'm sure you all are familiar with telegraph, right? But that's the Morse code, the dee 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 dee, where you do the series of dots and dashes and you communicate over long distances. That was sort of the first high-speed communication until we have the invention of the telephone. So transportation and communication is going to be huge. This is, of course, for passengers, right? So, but also for freight for businesses. So the passenger aspect is really interesting here. Prior to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, it could cost you hundreds of dollars to get all the way across the country, let's say to California, and it would take about 3 months, and sometimes longer, right? And you were really sort of limited in the time periods that you could make that journey. It would have to be during the summer, right? So you wouldn't hit any harsh weather in the mountains, etc. Now you could get on a train in New York City and for $65 in just 4 days, get from New York to California. So that was huge in terms of moving people from one place to another. This was also huge for California, who up until this time had really been, in many ways, isolated by lack of transportation. So when the railroads come to California, California immediately not only increases in population, but it also is able to conduct business a lot better by putting, goods onto trains and shipping them out into the eastern markets. The other thing that happens in the 1870s is the advent of the refrigerated railroad car. And so by then you can ship things like produce, or you can ship things like meat that has been butchered long distance as well. So that was huge. The other important thing to keep in mind is that the railroads provided a major employment opportunity for Americans. It had a huge workforce. People worked on operating the railroads. People worked on repairing the railroads. People worked in negotiating business deals between railroads and big companies. So there was just a lot of operational stuff to do on the railroads. And because of that, you have tens of thousands of Americans working for the railroads. The other thing that was happening is there's no regulation. As I mentioned, that's sort of one of the hallmarks of the Gilded Age, is the fact that there's little to no regulation in a lot of these industries. And so what ends up happening is there's a lot of backroom deals going on, right? So, for example, when we talk about John Rockefeller later on, and we talk about his special rebates that he would get from the railroads, this was a deal, a secret deal, basically, that he made with railroad companies so that his oil refining business would be at an advantage. The other thing is speculation, right? So a lot of times investors would invest in railroad companies, but it was not always a very good investment, because sometimes you would never see those railroad tracks, or you would never see sort of what was going on. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're an investor, you live in, I don't know, Philadelphia, and somebody approaches you and says, I've got this railroad company and we're building this railroad track out west across Montana, and it's going across these areas, and we're sure that these areas will eventually have towns and will eventually have businesses, and this is a huge opportunity for you to get into this at a cheap price, and we can guarantee you that your stocks will raise in value. Well, you might do that if you had a lot of money to throw away, but that would be a very sort of risky investment, right? Because you would never know whether or not that railroad construction was actually happening, or whether or not those types of, improvements like the building of towns or businesses would actually happen along those tracks. So that was another thing. So there was a lot of railroad companies that that acted like they were going to be big, but then they ended up busting and going bankrupt. And pretty soon you're just going to have a few major railroad companies in the United States. And at a certain point in U.S. history, there will be a monopoly on the railroad companies, which will be broken up by Theodore Roosevelt. But we haven't gotten to talking about Theodore Roosevelt yet. But so that will be coming on. But the main thing, right, is that some people are going to end up getting very, very rich with this type of business practice. But most people, they're just going to be the average workers, right? They're going to be the ones that are going to be running the operation, and they're not going to get rich. And in fact, in many ways, they were being taken advantage of. Okay, so if I haven't yet convinced you that the railroads had enormous amount of power and influence, hopefully this will convince you. And that's that the railroad companies will eventually be responsible for standardizing American time. So prior to 1883, um, places around the country went on something called local time. So sorry. I gotta work on this. All right, this is funny. Um, Local time. So what is local time? I'll tell you in a second. Okay. All right. So local time is time that is basically kept track of in a single location, right? So let's say here in the Coachella Valley, or I'm in Palm Springs right now. Okay, so let's say Palm Springs, and Palm Springs would have a time, and this time would be based on the position of the sun. Um, and it would basically be agreed upon by the people in the area that yes, this is the time. And typically, the local time would be kept by a clock tower in the town. Sometimes that clock tower was in a church, or sometimes it was just a regular clock tower. And that was the time, right? Local time. Now, in that scenario, you might travel 80 miles west of here towards Los Angeles. And Los Angeles, at the very same time as Palm Springs, might have a different time. Now, it might not be that different. It might be only a half an hour difference, or maybe in its most extreme case, an hour difference or something, but it might not be that big of a deal. But if you're operating a railroad company, this becomes a really big problem because railroad companies want to have schedules. They want to be able to tell their passengers and their uh, their customers that they're going to pick up them at a certain time and then they'll be dropped off at a certain time. Okay, so that was the issue. So basically, what happens is this consortium of railroad companies in 1883 get together and agree to standardize North American time with the creation of 4 different time zones, which we still have today. Excuse me, Pacific, Mountain, Central, and Eastern time zones. So this was really interesting because for a very long time, the government didn't officially recognize what was known as railroad time. And it wasn't until 1914 that time zones will officially be recognized by the United States government. So between 1883 and 1914, standardized time was oftentimes referred to as railroad time. And so, you know how if you like watches and if you look at an old pocket watch, oftentimes on the front of the pocket watch, there'll be engraved a locomotive. And that's sort of a nod to this idea of railroad time, right? Because if you worked on the railroad and you were like a conductor, for example, on the railroad, you're responsible for keeping those trains on time. You would be issued one of these pocket watches, and then you would be responsible for ensuring that the train left the station at certain intervals in order to stay on schedule. So not only are trains transforming the way that people do business and the way that people communicate and the way that people travel, but they are also literally changing the perception of time, literally changing what our time is. Okay, so now we're going to switch our attention to talking about a couple of examples of these captains of industry, sometimes called robber barons of the Gilded Age. And we're going to look at two classic examples. The first is Andrew Carnegie, and sometimes it's pronounced Carnegie. Both are correct. And Andrew Carnegie was a classic rags to riches story. He was born in Scotland to a basically a poor family. His family worked in the textile factories, and when mechanization of the textile factories came around in Scotland, basically his parents were put out of work. And so he was 12 years old. He had only had a couple of years of education. He knew how to read. He loved to read. Um, but he basically is taken away from the world in Scotland, put on a ship and goes across the Atlantic to the United States to look for opportunity with his parents. And they end up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where Andrew is basically expected to go to work to help support the family. And that's exactly what he does. He gets a job at a textile mill, but then eventually gets a job as a telegraph messenger, which was something that was common for the day for boys to, take these messages and run them around town, because the telegraph messages, they would come into the telegraph office, and then the telegraph operator would translate the message, and then that message would be written down or typed out, and then a messenger would have to carry it out to whoever the message was intended for. And so that was his job. Later on, he becomes himself a telegraph operator, and that ends up being something that it turns out he's very, very good at. And it's through all of these sort of series of events that lead him to catch the attention of his bosses, and he eventually will become managing um, one of the managers on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he ends up accumulating a certain amount of wealth once he gets to be put in this like sort of salaried, management position. And like many people of his day, once he was able to gain some wealth, he started to look for opportunities for investment. And he took a trip to Europe, and while he was in Europe, he witnessed a factory that was trying a new type of technique for creating steel called the Bessemer process. And the Bessemer process, it turns out, it was a way of heating up iron ore, these super hot temperatures, and then you would get this steel that would come out of this process that was very, very durable. And Andrew Carnegie recognized that this would be a major business opportunity for him because there were no Bessemer plants currently located in the United States. So he decides to travel back to the US and invest in opening up one of these Bessemer plants in Pittsburgh. And so that's exactly what he does. And this will be the decision that will ultimately make him an extremely rich man. Now, the process that he uses in order to kind of consolidate his wealth is something called vertical integration. And so that's what we're going to talk about right now. So I like to think of vertical, you have to excuse my drawings here, vertical integration as like a ladder. Over here. Okay, so think of vertical integration like a ladder. And in vertical integration, your goal is to basically own all the different steps on this ladder. Okay, so the first step is basically going to be the raw material. And in this case, we're talking about iron. Okay, So the iron ore. So Carnegie said, I want to own an iron ore mine. Okay. But then once the mine is extracted, the iron ore is extracted, we're going to need to move it to the manufacturing plant. So I want to own that railroad. Okay. All right. And then you get to the plant, right? The factory. And so you own the factory, obviously. That was the original intention. There's got to be a better way. All right. Factory. And then finally, once your product is complete, you want to own the distribution. Again, I apologize that this takes a long time. You can always fast forward. Okay, so the point is that through this vertical integration process, right, your company will own the mine that extracts the iron, the railroad that takes that iron ore to the factory, and then from the factory, you own all of the distribution networks out to the people that you are selling this steel to. Okay. The reason why this is an effective business practice is that you eliminate the middleman, right? Because if you only own this step of the process, the factory, then you are going to have to pay all of these different people, and they're gonna want to get a cut. So by owning the entire process, then your steel can be cheaper, right? So the money goes down for the price, and that means that more people are going to buy your product. Okay. So that's vertical integration. And again, I like to think of it like a ladder. And I wish I had a whiteboard, but whatever. Okay. So vertical integration is when you control all of the aspects of manufacturing, transportation, distribution. You could also add extraction to this list, right? You own the entire process, and that way your product is cheaper than other products on the market, and that way more people are going to buy from you. So what were people using steel for? Well, they were using steel for things like railroad tracks, right? In fact, that was one of the main applications that Andrew Carnegie saw for Bessemer steel in the first place. But he also couldn't have anticipated the fact that around this very same time that he's establishing these Bessemer plants, that cities are starting to be built on a massive scale. And by the time we get into the 1890s, you're talking about skyscrapers. And so, of course, the framework for skyscrapers are steel frames. So there's massive applications for Bessemer steel moving forward. And again, he's going to become very rich because of that. The other thing that's interesting about Andrew Carnegie, and I do recommend looking at this brief YouTube clip that just is basically an overview of his life, is the fact that he begins this philanthropic sort of standard for millionaires in the United States by writing a little booklet called The Gospel of Wealth. The Gospel of Wealth. And The Gospel of Wealth was written by Andrew Carnegie. And he basically says in this book that it is the responsibility of people who are wealthy to reach out and help the poor. So, for example, in his lifetime, he made a commitment to basically give all of his wealth to charity when he died. And he did exactly that. He did have one heir, a daughter, and he left her with $1 million, but the rest of his hundreds of millions of dollars, which in today's standards would translate to billions of dollars, went to charitable causes on his death. And he founded things like public libraries all throughout the country. Of course, Carnegie Hall in New York City, lots of various education causes and also political causes. Andrew Carnegie was a pacifist, and he spoke out against World War One. During World War One, he created a peace foundation to try to maintain global peace. So these were all like things that had not really been done before, and so he really does set that precedence for philanthropic work by rich people in the United States. So, two big things that he's known for, or I guess three. Number one, being very rich, and the classic rags to riches story. Number two, his use of vertical integration, which made him extremely rich. And number three, the philanthropic ideas that he laid out in the Gospel of Wealth. Okay, so now we're going to move on to talk about another titan of industry, John D. Rockefeller. And John D. Rockefeller is famous for having founded Standard Oil, and he makes his fortune in the oil refining industry. Like Carnegie, he will use a very specific business method to make his wealth. But before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about John Rockefeller. He was kind of a rags to riches story as well, although he wasn't an immigrant. He was born in New York, and he was raised by a mother who was very religious. But his father was a traveling salesperson and would often spend long um, uh, periods of time away from home and then come home with large amounts of money, mysteriously large amounts of money, and then hand it over to his mom, and then he would leave again. And so one of the things that Rockefeller learned from his mother is how to conserve money. And that really stuck with him for his entire life because his mother taught him, waste not, want not, that type of mentality. And so growing up, he was able to be really good at allocating resources and also being able to be very spendthrift. And in fact, it's that particular talent that got him into the grocery business, where he then will eventually become an accountant for a big grocer. And he eventually, like Carnegie, will be able to have a little nest egg where he'll be able to go and invest some of that money. And he decides to invest the money in a new type of industry, the oil refining industry. So, most of the oil that was utilized or consumed prior to the 1870s, 1860s was some type of animal oil, most likely whale oil. And that would be the type of oil that would be burned in lamps, be used for cooking, be used for heating, that type of thing. And the refinement of crude oil allowed for people to extract the crude oil from the earth, refine it, and then use kerosene as a replacement to whale oil. And you can see the obvious benefits of that, right? You don't have to go out into the ocean and hunt a whale and process, whale oil and all of that. So kerosene becomes the new highly desired form of refined oil. And so, keeping this in mind, John Rockefeller decides to open up an oil refining uh, plant outside of Cleveland, Ohio. And during this time period is when Cleveland, Ohio was in the midst of a big oil boom. They were finding oil deposits and drilling for oil all over the area. And so, by opening up the refinery in Cleveland, he didn't have to pay a whole lot for the oil to get from the drill site to the refinery. Now, as I mentioned before, the Carnegie was using vertical integration in order to make his wealth. And Rockefeller, on the other hand, is going to use horizontal integration. Horizontal integration. So let me explain to you what horizontal integration is. And I'm going to draw a diagram like I did for the vertical integration. So I like to think of horizontal integration as being like a horizontal line, right? And on the line, we'll put, this is Standard Oil. Okay, so this is Standard Oil Company. Okay. Over here, however, there's another oil company. Let's call that oil company A. Okay. And over here, there's another refinery. Let's call that oil company B. Okay. And Standard Oil is looking at these other oil companies and they're going, man, I don't like the fact that those oil companies are making money. How can I ensure that my company will make the most money? So what he decides to do is make a bunch of backroom deals, especially with the railroad companies. And he worked on getting something called rebates. Oh, geez. I got to figure out a better way, but for now, this is how it's going to work. Okay, rebates. Okay, so he would get these rebates from the railroad companies. Now, what did that mean? That meant that Rockefeller could take his Standard Oil and he could distribute it to various locations all over the country for cheaper rates. And because of that, he will be able to price his oil cheaper than his competitors, right? This is called predatory pricing. And so, because he's able to do this, pretty soon oil company A and oil company B are going to go out of business. And so Standard Oil comes along and goes, oh, oil company A, you're going out of business. You're declaring bankruptcy. I'm going to buy your company. And it absorbs oil company A. And then it comes over here and goes, oh, oil company B, you're going out of business and you're going to have to declare bankruptcy. And now I'm going to buy your company for super cheap. And now you all are going to be part of Standard Oil. So that is called horizontal integration. It essentially forms these massive trusts, or what we call nowadays corporations, right? That is the corporate model. So it is absorbing all of your competition in order to form one giant company. Now you should know that by the time we get to 1900, Standard Oil is basically providing 90% of all of the oil distributed in the United States. So this is a true monopoly, basically cornering all of the refined oil market. And this, of course, will make John Rockefeller incredibly rich. Okay. Not everybody was a fan of Rockefeller. In fact, he was the target of several investigations in terms of his business practice. There was a woman by the name of Ida B. Tarbell who wrote a series of um, investigative reporting articles on him in McClear's magazine, and basically she was exposing the fact that he was making all of these backroom deals and essentially absorbing all of his competition to become this gigantic monopoly that would essentially corner uh, the refined oil market. So it's that type of thing that led to cartoons like this, where you can see here we have Standard Oil, and Standard Oil is being depicted as this giant octopus, right, that is absorbing all of its competition. It's taking up all of the other oil companies. It's got the politicians in its tentacles. It's got the Capitol and the White House in its tentacles. And essentially, it's all powerful. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to talking about one of the most important developments of the latter half of the 19th century, and that's the fact that there are tons of inventions that are coming out during this time period. And these are typically inventions that are meant to speed up communication. These are inventions that are made to make people's lives easier or more efficient or more enjoyable. And so we're going to talk first about one of the most important inventions of the late 19th century, and that's the telephone. The telephone was originally invented by Alexander Graham Bell. Later on, Thomas Edison will perfect the telephone and the telephone design. But the important thing to keep in mind is that by the time we get to the 1880s, you are going to have long lines that are going to be built across the country to service American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T. And this will, AT&T, which started as originally was a telegraph company, will expand its services to include the telephone. Now, prior to this time period, if you wanted to communicate with somebody over long distances, you basically had two choices. You could write a letter, which would take sometimes could take up to a month or more to get to its destination, or you could send a telegraph. But a telegraph, even though it was much quicker, would have cost you money, and you would have had to pay for each of the words on the telegraph. So it could be very costly, and it was typically only reserved for short, very quick emergency messages, basically. So in order to, and it also wasn't private. So in order to correspond, privately with a loved one or something over a long distance, really the only choice you had was letter writing. And 19th century people were such wonderful letter writers. But the telephone is going to replace the sort of preferred method of communication slowly over time as we get into the 20th century. As you can see from the slide, by 1900, 1.5 million Americans will have access to a telephone. Now, what I mean by having access is basically that certain people are going to have to go to public telephones in order to use the telephone. Most people could not afford to have telephones in their private residence. It would have been very expensive, not just for the telephone equipment, but basically to pay the telephone company to come and lay the telephone wires out to your house. So it was basically reserved for the rich. So most people would have access to public telephones, and of course you would have to pay in order to use them. But it completely transforms the way that people communicate. Now, instead of writing letters and trying to express yourself verbally or through the written language, you would be able to just speak with the person that you're talking to over the telephone line. And this also allowed for a different type of communication where you could hear somebody's voice or you could hear the intonation in their voice, right? So it was very important, and especially in the latter half of the 19th century when people are moving distances apart. You might have been born on the East Coast, but you might move to the West to resettle out there, but you might still have family on the East Coast. So this allowed for those communications to remain between family members. Other really important inventions coming out of the 19th century would be things like the light bulb, the phonograph, and the motion picture camera, right? So all of these inventions are coming out of the Thomas Edison laboratories, and Thomas Edison is working out of New Jersey, Menlo Park, New Jersey, where he had a lab where he invited inventors to come and basically work on their inventions in his laboratory, and then he would eventually take credit for those inventions. By the time Edison had died, he had 1,093 patents to his name. 1,093, which is quite a few patents. And patents are basically legally binding blueprints for certain types of inventions, and it makes it so that other people can't use that type of technology or make money off of that technology moving forward. So he had 1,093 patents by the time he died, which is a lot. During this time period, the height of the invention era was basically 1870 to 1900. Obviously, the light bulb is going to be very transformative in terms of the way that people light both their houses and also their places of employment. Work in urban areas will be extended into the night hours with the invention of the light bulb. There will also be changes to the way that people recreate. So, for example, you could light up areas at night. You could have places like Coney Island lit up at night so that urban residents could go and, have a good time at the boardwalk at Coney Island. So electricity is going to be very transformative, but we're going to focus next on some of the other inventions coming out of this time period, like the phonograph and the motion picture camera. Okay, so here are a couple images of the inventors that we were just talking about. So you see Alexander Graham Bell there on your left and Thomas Edison on your right, standing in his laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey. And then down here at the bottom, you see pictured a man who I feel compelled to at least mention within this context, and that's Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla had worked under Edison at his laboratories and had been tasked by Edison to find a way to transmit electricity over long distances. And he actually did come up with a way to do that by inventing alternating current. Thomas Edison had invented the direct current, but the problem with the direct current was that it only traveled a certain distance before it had to then be transmitted again. So it was a very inefficient way of getting electricity over a long distance. So Nikola Tesla comes up with this idea of the alternating current, or the AC, and pretty soon Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla are in a competition with each other. Tesla takes his ideas to Thomas Edison's competitor, Westinghouse, and there starts to be this big sort of fight called the War of the Currents between these two men. But Nikola Tesla is a very interesting historical figure. He had a really fascinating life. He was an immigrant and ended up dying sort of a poor old man in the New Yorker Hotel in downtown Manhattan. And so he has a really sort of interesting arc to his life. And if you're interested, you can click on this link and find out more about it. There's a little mini biography here on Nikola Tesla. It's about 10 minutes long. Okay, so as I mentioned in a couple of slides back, I'm going to discuss two of a couple of the major inventions coming out of the Edison laboratories. Probably the most famous is the light bulb, but these two next inventions, the phonograph and the motion picture camera, are worth mentioning because they really do transform, in many ways, popular culture in the United States. So as you can see, this is invented patented by Thomas Edison in 1877. And basically what you're seeing in this image here is the prototype for the final design for the phonograph. And originally it came in these like wax cylinders. You can see here, this is a wax cylinder. And, you would have to uniquely produce each one of these wax cylinders. So in other words, a band would have to play a song and then set the grooves into the wax cylinder. So it was very inefficient. So the first design of the phonograph, there was not a whole lot of them that were produced. Most of the phonographs in this early design were played in public music rooms. So people would actually go to these public music rooms and sit around and listen to recorded music because it was such a novelty. It won't be until 1900 that Emil Berliner will develop a flat disc for recording. And then you will get what you see here, which is sort of the typical design that we think of when we think of a phonograph. So, of course, these flat discs are what we would now call records. And basically what this does is it allows for molds to be made so that the records could be reproduced on a massive scale. It also, of course, allows for easy storage. And once this design or this invention is completed, the phonograph becomes a much more popular item in private residences. So it's worth mentioning for a number of reasons. First off, this completely transforms the way that people listen to and enjoy music. So for example, prior to recorded music, the way that you heard music was live. You had to have somebody actually play the music in your presence. And so it was really common back in the day for somebody in the family to learn how to play an instrument, whether that was a fiddle or a cello or a piano. Piano was probably the most common, and that would allow for the family to be able to gather around and have musical entertainment and at least, maybe have Christian hymns on the holidays or whatever. So it allowed for that to happen. But this, of course, the phonograph is going to allow for people to enjoy music when they want to, at their leisure, oftentimes maybe in private if you wanted to enjoy music privately. Or this also allows for people to enjoy the same kind of music over long distances. So the fact that these songs could be replicated on a record and then distributed, throughout the country or even the world, is really sort of the basis for the development of popular culture. And the second major invention of the late 19th century, also credited to Thomas Edison, is the motion picture camera. And you see here the prototype for the motion picture camera, also called the kinescope. And it was invented in the 1890s. The design was redone several times until eventually you had sort of the modern or the motion picture camera that we're familiar with today with the wide lens. And that was something that that design has not changed all that much in the almost over 100 years since it was developed. You'll notice that by 1900, Nickelodeons, which were public movie houses called Nickelodeons because they cost a nickel, became popular places of entertainment throughout the country. They were inexpensive forms of entertainment. These are silent films or silent clips. And because of that, it made it even more popular because we haven't talked about it yet, but 1900 is also a year where the United States will see a huge immigration boom. So you have immigrants coming from all over the world into the United States, many of them not able to speak English, but the fact that they could sit in a movie theater and watch a silent film where the acting is very exaggerated and it's easy to understand. You didn't have to know English in order to be able to follow the plot lines of these silent films. They were also rather short, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes at the most. But again, probably the most popular form of entertainment, and that will really continue all the way into the 1920s, the 1930s. The first talkie film, as they were called, where you could actually hear people talking in the film, would be produced in 1926 with a movie called The Jazz Singer. So if you'd like to see an example of one of these early silent films, you can click on this link and it will show you a film from 1906 called The Motorist, and it's just kind of a whimsical. They use a little bit of like special effects in it, and it's I don't know, I find it entertaining. The other thing to understand is that this is really the beginning of the movie industry, right? Thomas Edison had his own studios that he opened in New Jersey and also in New York. And so he was a very shrewd businessman, and he really tried to corner the market of the movie industry. And in some sort of indirect way, he's responsible for having Hollywood develop because his competitors, instead of competing with him out in New Jersey and New York, decided to leave the East Coast and come out to California to make films in Hollywood. And it turned out that California was the perfect place to make films. And so the Edison film industry will not be able to survive the competition of the Hollywood industry that will develop in the 1920s. But early on, certainly Thomas Edison had a monopoly on the film industry. Okay, so now I am going to describe something called the analog revolution. Now, this is something that is not in your textbook because this is something that I learned about in graduate school, but I think that it is so fascinating that I always like to share it with students because it's an interesting thing to think about. Now, what is the analog revolution? So all around us, right, are these waves. And they're much prettier than that. All right. So all around us, there are these waves, and these are sound waves, and these are light waves. All right. So sound waves, and light. Now, you can't see these waves. They're invisible. They go through the air, right? So the analog revolution is the ability or the technological advances that allow human beings to capture sound and light. Sorry for the drawing. Sound and light. I'm trying to draw this with a mouse, which is very difficult. So what types of inventions allow this to happen? Obviously photography, right? So photography is the capture of sound and light. Or sorry, light. Photos. Okay. Now, what's another invention? The phonograph. We just talked about this one. Phonograph. So photos and the phonograph. These are all technological advances that allow us to capture sound and light. Now, that might not sound like much, but it actually impacts the world around us in really, really remarkable ways. And that's why historians call this a revolution, meaning that this will change the world, this will change the nature of how we understand ourselves and our world moving forward. So let's look at the impact of the analog revolution, which is the capture of sound and light on humanity. So first off, this awareness of self and other people, right? So once we have things like photography, it allows us then to see images of not just ourself and be able to reflect on ourselves and our image, but also other people, right? The idea that if you went off to war, you could take a photograph of your loved one and put it in your pocket, and take it out and look at it and think about that person and remember that person. That's completely transforming the way that we have relationships moving forward, because if you were away from that person for a very long time, their image might start to fade because memory isn't perfect. So this idea of having images of your loved ones or having an image of yourself that you could look at and reflect, right? That's a transformation. Number two, a connection to distant places and unfamiliar ideas. So very similarly, I may never travel to Madagascar, let's say, but I will be able to look at pictures of Madagascar if I want to and get a sense of what it looks like. Of course, with the medium of film, I can even get a sense of what it sounds like there, how things move there, what the animals are like there, right? So I might never get a chance to go to Madagascar, but because I have all of these mediums that originated with the analog revolution, I can now, imagine or go to that place without actually being there. Okay, another major consequence or impact of the analog revolution is the development of popular culture. And I think that this one is pretty obvious, but I'll explain, which is that you have the development of recorded music, which, as I said, can be distributed far and wide. And so therefore you can popularize certain songs. Very similar in the movie industry. Movies could be distributed across the country, even sometimes across the globe. And so you get popular movies. You get, as a result of that, you get popular people, like actors and actresses. So there's this development of a popular culture as a direct result of the analog revolution moving forward. And then the development of a personal identity. So you can look at these things, you can look at photographs, you can listen to songs, you can watch a movie, and you can sort of learn something about yourself through those things by knowing what your reaction is to them. Do I like this? Do I not like that? Right? And so it really does help you sort of, it enriches your sense of who you are as an individual and as a person. And then finally, this idea of the development of a national identity. And this is also very important. So what we see in the latter half of the 19th century, not just in the United States, but around the world, is the development of things like national anthems, right? And national anthems can now be recorded and distributed across the country. And so these ideas of bringing the country together in some kind of united way through this new medium and through these new types of dissemination of culture, either through music or through video or through movies. This is a huge, huge development, and it does help nations sort of forge together and bring together a national identity. Okay, and our final key term for this lecture is social Darwinism. And this is really an important concept to understand when we think about the way in which sort of the elite of society thought in the latter half of the 19th century during the Gilded Age. This idea of social Darwinism. So some of you might be familiar with Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin wrote theories of evolution back in the 1850s. And his idea was that, basically animals evolved through this process of survival of the fittest, right? The most fit, the most evolved is the most likely to survive the next generation. Well, that's more like biological evolution. Social Darwinism is talking about how fit you are to survive within society. And the way that that's measured is with wealth. How rich are you? And so social Darwinists subscribe to this idea that richness equated to fitness. And the second part of that idea is that that process should not be manipulated or should not be interfered with, right? So that basically, if somebody is unfit to survive in society, meaning that they're poor or they're unhealthy, then you should not reach out and try to help that person. Instead, you kind of allow them to not evolve, that they wouldn't evolve or be able to survive in society, and that the rich should not reach out and help the poor, because if they do that, then somehow that disrupts this natural process. Now, this is an extremely dangerous idea. It's a very cruel idea. It's one of the reasons why it took so long to institute laws to help poor people in this country. In fact, it's not going to be until the 1930s and the Great Depression that we're going to see any real true relief for people that are impoverished, and that was basically out of complete and total necessity. But the other thing about this is that social Darwinism leads to the very dangerous ideas of eugenics and this sort of racial purity and social purging and all of these ideas that will eventually lead to the actions of the Nazis and others in these genocidal exercises like the Holocaust. And so it is a very dangerous idea, but it is one that a lot of people, and especially people who were wealthy in the late 19th century and the early 20th century throughout the Gilded Age, believed this to be true. And it allowed for this social inequality to continue. William Graham Sumner, who I put down here, was one of several of these social Darwinist theorists that wrote influential books, and his book was called What Social Classes Owe to Each Other, and that was published in 1883. So you can see that during the Gilded Age, corruption was rampant, and it allowed for people to get very, very rich, but it also continued this high level of economic and social inequalities. New inventions are going to make life more efficient, make businesses more efficient, going to provide more entertainment opportunities, but it's also going to allow, again, for certain people who have access to it to become very rich. All of this corruption and coupled with the economic depressions of of 1873 and 1893 will eventually end up uh, resulting in this huge call for reform of the system, right? And that will lead us into the progressive era, which we will talk about when we get there. Important laws are passed that will help with future reform. So laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in 1890, wasn't first used to break up trusts, but when Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, he's going to take that old law out of the closet, so to speak, and kind of use it to try to break up trusts. So there are some laws that are passed to try to work towards reform in the late 19th century, but they have little to no power behind them because nobody is enforcing them. And finally, the country is becoming much more urban. People are beginning to move out of the countryside and more into cities. And a new type of worker is emerging, and this is the factory employee. And these are the employees that are in many ways going to suffer the most during the Gilded Age. They have absolutely no labor protections. They are exploited, and it will lead to massive labor movements and unrest. And so we will talk about that in our next lecture. Thanks, and if you have any questions, please either drop by the Zoom office hours or send me an email or post on the discussion board.